Welcome back to another episode of Written for Our Admonition. We're continuing our study in the Old Testament, picking up today in our conversation about the book of Judges, or more specifically, the cycle of Judges, which is narrated to us by the book that also shares that name. To review what has gotten us to this point, let's just think about our previous lesson that we talked about the entering of the Promised Land by Israel during the time of Joshua. And you recall that after Moses had transgressed there by striking the rock rather than speaking to it, he was not going to be permitted to enter the Promised Land and lead the people of God therein. And so Joshua would take that mantle and lead the people into the land and ensure that they inherited what God had set aside for them many, many years before. And that's what they do. The book of Joshua is triumphant. It's victorious. It shows the people of God taking seriously God's promises. It shows them working with Him to accomplish His will. There's so many good and positive lessons that emerge from that book that we briefly talked about in our former conversation that in many respects, when you come to the book of Judges, are completely turned upside down. And we're going to see a few of the factors that contributed to that in just a moment. But we have to realize that when we come to the book of Judges, we are dealing with what is hands down the craziest book in the Old Testament and the craziest period in Israel's history. And we don't say that lightly. It may sound a bit comical to utter it that way, but it really is the truth, because when you read this book, it is a rapid-fire situation from judge to judge and evil to evil of all these different things that are happening, and it really paints this horrible picture of what took place in this period of time, and it's very mixed. There's some good things that happen. We're going to talk about a handful of those because there's only a handful to choose from when we get to the end of this, but there's not a lot of good to pick from. There's a lot of bad to pick from and a lot of negative examples. But man, it is just overflowing with horrible situations that arose in Israel that were completely avoidable, and yet simply were not avoided. But let's consider a couple of things about the book of Judges in this period of history in Israel, just so we understand what we're talking about. The first thing that we have on our slideshow just to mention here is the fact that this period of Israel's history did not just last for a decade or two. This was a several hundred-year affair. So you're dealing with what is potentially up to 400 years of Israel's history encapsulated in the book of Judges. And that is not a good thing, because that's nearly 10 generations that are impacted by the horrific situations that unfold in this book, this constant back and forth and this constant fighting that they had among themselves and among the nations. It definitely was not what it should have been, but it had a great impact on their history and a great impact on many, many generations, not just one or two like we might expect. And the other part of it that I don't have on the slideshow here, but just to understand what a judge actually is. This is not someone who is going to be per se in a courtroom setting dictating out to people what the law says or anything of that nature. That's not really what is meant there by judge. It's more someone that God has empowered to deliver His people from their captors and the enemies that they're facing at that particular time. And so you're going to see a lot of different judges that rise up in Israel's history here, a lot of different people who took on that mantle, and it did involve judgment to a certain extent. You see that, for instance, with the judge Deborah, who was administering judgment under that tree there in Judges chapters 4 and 5. So you do have that type of idea going on in the book, but more than anything, it's talking about a specific person who was empowered by God to deliver His people when they were enslaved or facing difficulty of various kinds. And that leads us smoothly into this next conversation we're going to have about why this time was so chaotic. So we understand this period of time lasted for a long time, several hundred years. We understand these judges were individuals that God raised up for this purpose to deliver His people. But why did this even happen? What led to this situation? Again, the book of Joshua leaves us with the impression that after that, things should have been going pretty smoothly. That things should have been pretty good for Israel after his time as their leader, as their commander, and after they have basically inherited the Promised Land. Remember from last week, we talked in Joshua 21 and verses 43 through 45 that God fulfilled His promise to give Israel the land. So again, there's a high note there. It really seems triumphant. It seems victorious. But when you get to the book of Judges, it all starts to fall apart. So we've identified three factors here that seem to have contributed to that in the most significant ways. By no means are these exhaustive, but these three seem to really summarize the problem that took place between Joshua and Judges to produce the situations that we're going to find in the book. And the first one is this: the Israelites grew complacent. We're not going to read Judges chapter 1, verses 27 through 36, but that chapter in general, chapter 1 of Judges, and that specific set of verses, it talks in detail about these different tribes and how they were supposed to inherit the land that God gave them, and there were, for the most part, a lot of the territory inherited by them, and they did what God wanted them to do, but they also left a lot of people in the land. And it was for a variety of reasons. Maybe they had chariots of iron that they were not able to defeat. maybe they were too strong at a certain point and they just said, we'll just put them under tribute, and then when we're stronger, we'll take care of them later. Whatever the case might have been, they were pretty complacent about the situation and didn't really see the urgency of casting those people out of the land like God said. They didn't really take seriously God's law when it specifically told them that if they left those people around, it was only going to cause corruption within Israel and lead them to the very situation that Judges teaches us. So when we think about that and look at that, we see that their complacency was one major factor that led then to the cycle we're going to talk about momentarily, where that laziness translated to practical consequences. Because they left those people in the land, they had an evil influence upon them, they were leading them to do things they should not have done. On and on we could go talking about how that influence corrupted Israel from the inside out and led them to do things God did not want them to do, simply because they did not take the initiative and show the diligence necessary to accomplish what God set before them. The second reason that we've identified here as far as why this time was so chaotic is the fact that the generation after Joshua simply was not taught about God or what he did for Israel. And again, that is puzzling sometimes when we consider that. Because once again, Joshua is a faithful person. We read about his situation. We read about who he was. There's no doubt in our minds that he was a faithful man. And yet, he did not teach the generation after him about God and what God had done for them. And to be fair, maybe it wasn't just Joshua himself. It was the elders who also outlived Joshua. It was a whole host of other people who could be lumped in there as well. So we're not trying to make it as though he's shouldering the burden with this situation. But that is to say that he and the people around him did not take seriously the charge to teach those coming after them about the severity of God and the goodness of God and all that he was doing for them and why they had ended up in the land and what he had accomplished on their behalf. On and on they could have gone about all the goodness and wonders of God, and they simply didn't. And so you have a generation, like Judges chapter 2 and verse 10 says, that did not know the Lord. And again, in addition to the fact that Joshua and his generation didn't teach the people coming after them about these things, that's another staggering idea, because these are the people of God we're talking about. We're not talking about a pagan nation. We would almost expect that in the Old Testament period for people to not know about God if they're in a pagan nation. But for Israel to not know God, for them to not know about his works, I mean, that is just unexplainable in some respects to us. But that was the situation that they were in. That was what they were facing. They were, in many respects, totally ignorant of what was good and right before God, or even who God was. And so you can imagine that when ignorance is present like this, you're going to have a whole list of problems. You're going to have a whole lot of people who have no clue what they're supposed to be doing, and they're just going to do whatever comes naturally to them. And that leads into the third reason why this time was so chaotic. There was no strong leadership. The passages I have on the screen there, Judges chapter 17 and verse 6 and chapter 21 and verse 25, say basically the same thing. That in those days there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And it's interesting that it inserts those statements after circumstances that really prove just how crazy things were and show just how much a difference a strong leader could have made. But let's talk about Joshua again for a moment. I know we're picking on him quite a bit in this particular conversation, but we're doing so with purpose, and we're not trying to slander his reputation here. But Joshua was a strong leader. He was someone who took seriously the charge to lead the people of God in the way that he wanted. Joshua was not a king. He was not a dictator. He was a commander of their military structure, essentially, but more than that, he was someone that the Israelites respected and looked up to. And the way that he went, in many respects, mirrors the way that the people went. So as he was strong and courageous and carrying out God's will, the people did the same thing. And then when he's gone, and the elders who outlived him are gone, you have a power vacuum that's emerged. In other words, there's no strong leaders that have emerged. There's no one like Joshua. There's no one like the elders who came after him. There's no strong leadership structure in Israel. And so again, it kind of just falls to individuals to figure out what direction they should go. And as Judges proves and shows, that direction is almost always negative. That's not how it ought to be, but that's the reality of the situation. They did whatever was right in their own eyes, and many times that is exactly opposite of what God would have them to do. So all that is to say that these three factors together produced a perfect storm in the most negative way possible for Israel's history and the situation they would now face in the book of Judges that leads to the need for judges in the first place. And so we're going to see a predictable cycle here that emerges in Israel where it was something completely avoidable. It could have been broken. Something could have been done about it. And yet, because of the factors that we've just discussed, they simply were not. So let's turn our attention now to talk about this cycle that we find in the book of Judges, because this is really what the book is all about. We could talk about the specific judges like Jephthah and Gideon and Deborah and all these, and I would encourage you to read the book to understand who those people were and what they did. But really, the more important thing in Judges is the cycle itself of how this even happened in the first place and why it was necessary for a judge to emerge and what God is able to do through these people. So the thing that we learn very quickly in the book of Judges, in chapter 2 specifically in verses 11 through 23, which we'll read here in just a moment, we find that although there were numerous judges that served in Israel, the fact that the nation never really took the lessons that those judges taught them very seriously, and they did not take the deliverance they received very seriously either. They kept on going back to the same sins that led to the situation that needed the judge in the first place. So it's just this constant cycle. It's this constant back and forth and this tug of war in the nation where they start doing good things when the judge delivers them from their enemies, but it's not long before they're right back to where they started. It's a horrible situation, but it really shows very clearly how easy it is to fall into that type of cycle and how hard it can be sometimes to break that. So let's turn our attention then, without further ado, to Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 23. We'll talk about this cycle in detail, and I want you to pay attention to how the text words this and how it presents to us what took place here in the nation and why this was so problematic. So here we are in Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 23. Sorry about that little blip there with the PowerPoint. But let's just go ahead and read this together here in Judges 2, starting in verse 11. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them, and they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. So he delivered them into the hands of plunderers who despoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods, and bowed down to them. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers walked, and obeying the commandments of the Lord, they did not do so. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. And it came to pass, when the judge was dead, that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers, by following other gods, to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. Then the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, Because this nation has transgressed my covenant which I commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, so that through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord, to walk in them as their fathers kept them, or not. Therefore the Lord left those nations, without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them into the hand of Joshua. So there's a lot that's happening in that chapter, and in this text specifically. So notice this cycle. It's pretty familiar. It's something that we see repeating over and over and over again. So it all starts off like this in verses 11 through 12. They forsake the Lord. They turn away from him and instead serve idols. And again, we've already kind of addressed this because we saw that leaving the other nations in the land directly led to this. Notice what verse 12 says. They followed other gods from among who? The gods of the people who were all around them, and they bowed down to them. They didn't learn about those in a vacuum. They learned about them because their neighbors among these other nations were showing them. And they were pursuing that because, in their minds, what was the difference? It also was contributed to by ignorance and a lack of leadership. So it all feeds in together to produce this cycle to where the Israelites abandoned God. They abandoned him and his ways. They began serving idols. They were spitting in many ways in the face of his covenant and his law. They're going against him in the worst ways possible. And so predictably, in verse 14, what does that lead to? The anger of God. His anger is hot against Israel, so he hands them over to their plunderers. He causes them to be sold into the hands of their enemies. They're being defeated at every turn. No matter what they do, they're being fought against. They face calamity every step of the way because they're not on God's side. And yet, verse 16, God raises up a judge to deliver them out of the hands of those who plundered them. And even when they wouldn't listen to the judge, even when these people continued to do the evil things they had been doing for years and years and years, God still empowered the judge. He was still with the judge. He allowed that judge to deliver the people of Israel from their enemies. And yet, after all that, after they finally had peace and they had rest because of God's efforts through these judges, as soon as the judge was dead, they went right back to where they started. And so this is the cycle that you find narrated all throughout this book. And it becomes almost a joke in some respects when you think about it this way, but again, it reflects human behavior. It really shows how cyclical we can be. That is to say, how we're so routine and we can get so stuck in a routine that is not so good, and how we can easily forget the lessons that we had learned previously and just go right back into the same way that we were living before. So it's not as though it's unfamiliar to us. It's very human, in fact. But it's the fact that they kept on doing this that really shows the trouble that the judges faced in this period of their history and just how bad it was in Israel during this time. And so that cycle really just stands out to us, and that's why it's important to read that and understand that fundamentally to really have the key to understanding the book as a whole, because that really shows what the period was all about and why it was such a problem. So every story that you read about in Judges about these different people, like Jephthah and Gideon and Deborah and so on we could go, you're reading that cycle come to life in different situations, and you're seeing why it was such a problem and seeing how the factors that we've already considered in the previous slide, how those all factor into each situation. So up to this point, it's not been a very positive image. This has not been good in any respect. There doesn't seem to have been any good at all that emerged during this time. And yet there was still some good that came from this. The period of the Judges is not all bad. In many respects, it is pretty bad, but it's not all bad. So how could it be possible that there was something good that came out of this? Well, for one thing, for us today specifically, what are the lessons that we learn about God and His mercy, His compassion, and His graciousness? This is something that I will talk about quite often as we continue on in this series about the Old Testament. But we've got to get out of this mindset that God was this tyrant in the Old Testament that just wanted to zap people all the time. That is not who God is. That is not who He's ever been. He does not show that in the Old Testament. Now, to be sure, like we just read in the text in Judges chapter 2, God was angry with His people. But was His anger unjustified? Was He wrong to be angry with them after they violated His covenant and spit in His face and began serving other gods? He was absolutely justified. But it's the fact that even amid that anger, He shows them mercy. He does not give them what they deserve. He shows them compassion. He is moved to pity for the very people who have abandoned Him, and He's gracious to them. He shows them something that they could not earn for themselves. He's willing to forgive them and allow them one more chance to do what's right in His sight, and not just one more chance, but a second chance after that, and a third one, and a fourth one, and on it goes. It really shows us a lot about God and His enduring patience and His love for His people, no matter how far away they went from Him. Now, that does not justify in any respect what they did. That does not mean that what God did was a license for them to continue in sin. But that does mean that even through that circumstance and even through the horrific nature that they had given themselves over to, God was able to shine His light brightly. He was able to show the level of love that He had for them and His commitment to their success and the fact that He wanted them to do well. But then on the other side of that coin, just so we have a balance here, we also see that God was more than willing to judge His people when they were unfaithful to Him. He was more than willing to hand them over to their plunderers when they were not doing what He commanded them to do. He would give them a time and a space to repent and to do what was right, but if they refused, He had no hesitation handing them over. He was more than willing to judge. So while He is merciful and compassionate and gracious in the book of Judges, we also see that He is willing to judge as well, because again, His justice demands it. So we have to understand that balance that we find there about God in the book of Judges, but the fact that it's not just one picture we get of Him, but it's multiple pictures. But man, does His mercy, His compassion, and His graciousness really come to the surface of this book. But then we also can learn a lot about the judges themselves, or from the judges themselves, I should say. When you think about these different people like Gideon and Jephthah, you are dealing with people who are deeply flawed. And I mean deeply flawed, more than we might expect. And you read about someone like Jephthah especially, and he's labeled as a worthless person, in fact. He hung around with worthless people. He was not anyone that you would ever expect to be a man of God doing His will. He's as far away from that as you could imagine. And yet God is able to raise him up to be a judge and to deliver Israel through his hand. Now again, Jephthah's a pretty bad guy. So is Gideon. So were a lot of these people like Samson. Samson, I'll be fair with you and honest with you that he's my least favorite of all Bible characters. But I have to admit that God was able to use him to bring about His will. He was able to use even someone like Samson to bring about a good outcome. He was able to deliver His people through that mechanism. And so through these evil people that we see throughout this book, who should have been something that they were not, who should have been better, who should have been stronger, who should have been more faithful, God was able even to use these weak people to accomplish His will. And so that lesson stands out as well in this book, where we learn that bright light and that reality that even if we are in a bad circumstance, and even if we have not always been the people we should have been, God can still use us. And we ought to strive to be the best that we can be as a result, because God is able to empower us to overcome the obstacles that we face. And in one final point that we'll make here before we wrap things up, it was during this time in the Judges that we have another book by the name of Ruth. And it tells us about Ruth herself, who was a Moabite woman, and she returns to the land of Israel with her mother-in-law Naomi. And through the various happenings in the book of Ruth, we find that God is able to use her, despite her background, despite her situation. He's able to use her to raise up a future king, David, and to produce a lineage in Israel that would go down in their history as one of the most famous and one of the most powerful because of God's blessings. And so even amid this time in the Judges, it's not all bad. Now, that is to say, it is still pretty bad, but it's not all bad. And there are so many lessons we can learn, even beyond what we've briefly described here, that help us to really see that this book reflects human nature in many respects, but it also reflects God's nature in a very vivid way, and helps us to appreciate just how merciful, compassionate, and gracious He is, and just what a difference His light can make, even amid how dark an hour may be. So this time in Israel's history was no good, but there was still good that came out of it. And we're going to see as we transition away from the Judges going into the Kings, so we're going to talk about Saul and David and Solomon and go on from there, that as we transition away from this, that these lessons are still going to surface. We're still going to see the echoes of this in the kingship itself. And yet, when we come back to the book of Judges and we think about the history that takes place here, it most certainly has its own unique place in its own area of history for Israel. So all that being said, we want to make sure we dwell on this in the right way, we think about this the right way, we study this in the right way, and we allow this to help us to understand why this period was so bad for Israel and the lessons that we can learn from that. So we'll pause there for right now, and we'll decide to pick up next week in our conversation about King Saul and the beginning of the kingdom in Israel, and we'll continue to keep these lessons in mind that we've learned here and previously as we move forward in our study. As always, I thank you for your time and attention to this lesson, and I hope it's been a benefit to you. Thank you.